It's Friday, which means it's time for another mailbag. Today, I'll go over my biggest question about the team in 2024, whether or not the Irish should pursue a defensive tackle in the transfer portal, and my favorite Notre Dame football team in my lifetime. That's all coming right up.
You are Locked On Irish, your daily podcast on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? Welcome into Locked On Irish, your daily Notre Dame podcast. Today is Friday, January 26th. So happy Friday, and thank you for getting your Friday started right here by making this your first listen of the day. I'm Tyler Wojciak, and I'm the host. I graduated from Notre Dame in 2018, and now I'm a producer covering college football for Fox Sports. First and foremost, please take a second to like the video below and subscribe to the channel. If you're watching along on YouTube or if you're listening to the podcast, you can help us out a great deal by rating the show 5 stars, maybe even leave a nice review, and subscribe if you have not already. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. If this is your first time joining us this week, we had plenty of great stuff on the show. I had recruiting insider Kevin Sinclair on Tuesday's episode to talk recruiting and recap Notre Dame's Junior Day event. Then on Wednesday, I went over the impact of Gabriel Rubio's decision to step away from the team. And yesterday, Luke Smith and I had a ton of fun playing buy or sell as we tried to forecast the future of Notre Dame football. But today, as we do on pretty much every Friday episode, we got another mailbag. This week, though, I kicked things off by putting out on Twitter a little prompt. I asked, what's your favorite Notre Dame football team from your lifetime? I got some great responses, so we'll spend the back half of this show reminiscing a little bit about the past teams that we love to watch. But let's start off with a couple of questions submitted by you, and thank you to everyone who submitted your questions. As always, I really appreciate it. This first one comes from Cindy M. Now that Harbaugh has left Michigan, do you think the NCAA will go easier on them, or will they still bring the hammer? Personally, I still think they're going to bring down the hammer. I think they might even punish him even harder because they won't be able to punish Harbaugh, and they've had an ongoing battle for the past couple of years. So I don't think that this is going to stop the NCAA at all, especially if Sharon Moore is elevated to become the new head coach, which we all expect he will be. He was implicated in some of the sign stealing stuff as well. He was part of those investigations, even though he didn't get the suspensions in the season from that scandal. I believe he missed the first couple of games because of the whole burger thing, which was, oh man, that was ridiculous. The sign stealing thing is a lot more serious. So yeah, I think the NCAA is going to come in, and I think they're going to punish them pretty hard. I think that's part of the reason why Jim Harbaugh left for the NFL. You think back to when Pete Carroll, when he left USC in January of 2010, I believe, he saw the writing on the wall. He knew USC was going to get hit really hard by sanctions, and he bolted to the Seahawks. And man, if you look back on that, the NCAA threw the book at USC. It was extreme. They gave them a 2-year postseason ban, 4 years probation. They lost 30 scholarships over 3 years, which is a ton. That was unprecedented at the time. Not to mention the fact that USC had a bunch of wins vacated due to the improper benefits given out to Reggie Bush. And I think O.J. Mayo was part of that as well, though he was a basketball player. That investigation took 4 years to complete. Like I was just saying, Reggie Bush was the subject in all of this, and they didn't actually hand out these sanctions until 2010. So I think the NCAA is going to move a little bit faster with this whole ordeal. They already started it during the season. But yeah, I definitely think the NCAA is going to come in, and they're going to come down hard on Michigan. And who knows, this might be like the final act for the NCAA, because who knows what their future is and their relevance is as it pertains to college football. So maybe they just try to go out with a bang and really give it to Michigan after they had just won the national championship. Okay, let's move on here. This next question comes from @rfritz40. What is your biggest question mark about this team heading into the 2024 season? So I've been getting this question a lot. I even did an episode about this a couple weeks ago where I went over all of my questions sort of at the start of the new year. But for my top one, as we sit here today in late January, it's got to be the offensive line. And maybe some of you are already sick of hearing me talking about how concerned I am about this group. But, you look at what they're returning from last season, there might be only one starter who returns from the opening day group that came out last season, and that's Pat Coogan at guard. Now, Rocco Spindler is going to be back on the team, but he suffered a season-ending injury at the end of last season, and I think that's going to impact his availability in spring practice, which could open the door for Billy Schrout to step in and take over the other starting guard opposite Pat Coogan. You look at the tackle positions, Notre Dame is going to be breaking in at least 2 new starting tackles. Maybe they'll be able to add a tackle in the transfer portal who has some starting experience, but right now it looks like it's going to be Charles Jagasaw at left tackle and then either Emil Wagner or Tosh Baker at right tackle. And considering out of all the positions in football, the one that values experience the most is the offensive line, not just on an individual basis, but playing together as a group. And this group has just not really played together that much. And I'm not even necessarily saying that, I think the offensive line is going to be bad. I don't think that's the case. Notre Dame has recruited the position too well over the past 5 to 7 years for that group to just have a complete drop off. But I am concerned because if Notre Dame is going to be a great team, if they want to achieve the goals that they set out to achieve, they have to have an elite offensive line. They can't just be a good offensive line or above average group. That just can't be the case. Notre Dame is not built at the playmakers on the outside to be able to win at that high of a level if they don't have a really good foundation on the offensive line. And I don't expect this group to drop off quite like the 2021 group did. I mean, that was such a mess. You had a true freshman and Blake Fisher starting at left tackle to start the season. Then he suffered a season-ending injury in that season opener against Florida State. And then they were trying Tosh Baker, who was much younger at the time. That didn't work. Then they ultimately landed on Joe Alt at left tackle, which turned out to be a revelation, basically. He sort of stabilized things there at left tackle and then blossomed into the player that we all know Joe Alt to be. Now he's probably going to be a top 10, maybe even top 5 pick here in the NFL draft in a few months. But that was not fun, especially at the beginning of the year, man. That offensive line was terrible. Notre Dame, thank God they had Kyron Williams because there was absolutely no running game outside of him, and he would just fight through so many tackles to get some yards. And then as the season went on, they did get a little bit better. Tommy Rees adjusted the offense a little bit so that they were a little bit more catered to the struggles in the offensive line. They started to go hurry up tempo a lot. They started to throw a lot of quick passes so that the defense didn't have as much time to get in on the backfield. But it took a long time to get there and a lot longer than any of us would have liked at the time. So Notre Dame is going to have to get things figured out early, considering that they have to go to Kyle Field in College Station to open up the season. They don't really have a ton of time to figure things out. I'm not asking them to be a finished product in week 1. That's not even close to being realistic, or even at the start of October. This is going to take some time, but I'm just really concerned about the fact that there are so many guys playing who don't have that much experience at the college level. And some of these guys might not even be playing the position that best suits them. Like if Charles Jagasaw starts at left tackle, he could be serviceable there. He could end up being a good left tackle in the college game, but he's probably best suited to play guard, given his size, his mobility, things like that. Then there's a guy like Emil Wagner who has the ability, or at least the athletic ability, to play left tackle, but right now he lacks the size. So they have a lot of things to figure out between now and then, but it is going to be something that we talk about a lot on this podcast. I'm sure you're going to hear it from a lot of other people who cover the team and talk about it for a living. But right now, that is my biggest question mark as we sit here on January 26th. All right, coming up next, should Notre Dame look for a defensive tackle in the transfer portal following the loss of Gabriel Rubio? Plus, I'll share my favorite Notre Dame team in my lifetime. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With great deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for all of the fun you're going to have. I actually used Gametime earlier this week on Sunday to go to a Laker game. I had a friend in town. We wanted to go see LeBron play in person on Sunday. We're like, hey, let's see what happens with these NFL games. Maybe we could hit the Laker game after Chiefs-Bills. We found some great prices on Gametime, bought the tickets, and had a great night. It is the fastest growing ticketing app in the country for a reason. You get images of your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. Plus, you can buy tickets in a matter of seconds, just 2 taps and you're set. And the tickets are sent directly to your phone, so you never have to dig through your email. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, our next question and our last question of the day, at least our last question submitted by you, then we'll get into my favorite Notre Dame football team of all time. This one comes from Frank Sayre, who asks, should Notre Dame get a defensive tackle in the transfer portal? I think they should definitely try. Following the loss of Gabriel Rubio, as I talked about earlier this week, his future with the program and the university is uncertain right now. Again, at this point in time, we have not heard an official announcement from Notre Dame or Gabriel Rubio. We just know that he's not enrolled in the university and therefore not on the football team. And even though that Gabriel Rubio wasn't projected to be a starter this season, that's going to be Howard Cross and Riley Mills lining up on the interior. You still need quality backups, especially on the defensive line, because that's a position that needs to rotate a lot. Guys get exhausted. They're running into 350-pound dudes or whatever, and they have to do it over and over again. And frankly, that drains guys over the course of the game, and you need to be able to rotate guys in who have fresh legs and are able to come off and fire off the ball with a ton of energy. So odds are the market is not going to be great for a really high-level defensive tackle in the transfer portal in the spring cycle. Now, that's not to say that you might get lucky and there ends up being a really good defensive tackle prospect that Notre Dame could land, and maybe that's the case. But I think the more realistic outcome is that Notre Dame pursues a guy kind of like Chris Smith, the Harvard transfer who was on the team back in 2022. That season, Chris Smith played 265 snaps as the backup behind Jason Adamiola and Howard Cross, and he had a pretty productive season in that role. He finished with 17 total tackles. He had 9 stops, according to Pro Football Focus. He also added a forced fumble and 2 quarterback hurries. That's pretty similar production to what Gabriel Rubio had this past season, although Rubio played about half the number of snaps, a little bit more than half, because he was dealing with an injury that kept him out of the first few games after the Navy game. But that's decent production for a backup defensive tackle, especially when you consider what Notre Dame has at the starting defensive tackle. Like, I think Cross and Mills, if they're not the best combo on the interior defensive line in all of college football, they're certainly up there. Like, it would not have been shocking at all if both those guys ended up leaving for the NFL, but then they decided to stay, which is obviously huge for Notre Dame. But, guys get hurt, things happen, and there's a good chance that whoever's the backup at defensive tackle is going to have to play a decent amount this season. Now, if Notre Dame is unable to land a transfer at defensive tackle, I think it's going to be on Donovan Heinisch and Jason Anye to really step up and make some plays in that role. I'm really excited about what Donovan Heinisch can do, and I think a big part of that is how good his brother ended up being, despite the fact that he didn't enter Notre Dame as a top recruit, and now what he's doing in the NFL, like, it's crazy. It's crazy that Kurt Hinish is as productive of an NFL player for the Houston Texans as he is, but it's great to see, and that family just breeds badass dudes who play defensive tackle. Like, I remember seeing a picture of Donovan Heinisch on signing day with his dad, and he is the most Pittsburgh guy of all time. I love it, right? And that's exactly what you want at defensive tackle. So I'm excited for his future. I think the spring practice is a huge opportunity specifically for Donovan Heinisch because he's still pretty young. I mean, Jason Anye probably is going to be the first guy off the bench. He's going to be a senior, but I think if you think about the long-term future of those guys, really excited about Donovan Heinisch, but still, even though I'm excited about his future, I think Notre Dame should look to add an experienced defensive tackle that can play in the interior and just add some depth. It's like a safety net. It's good to have in case any injuries or any other unforeseen circumstances happen. But still, the best case scenario for Notre Dame is that Gabriel Rubio is able to return to the team in the summer. He gets back on track with whatever he has going on, and I'm hoping for the best for him because he would obviously be a big piece for Notre Dame heading into 2024. Okay, now it's time to talk about my favorite Notre Dame football team of my lifetime. I'm going to get into some of your responses in the next segment, but first I want to tell you what my favorite team is. And I'm going to be honest, as I was doing this exercise, it was really hard for me to figure out. Obviously, it came down to the teams who won the most talented teams. So even though the teams in like 2009, which had a bunch of great offensive players like Jimmy Clausen, Golden Tate, Michael Floyd, Kyle Rudolph, even though those offenses were a ton of fun to watch, they still finished like 6-6. So it wasn't that great, right? They lost to UConn, which I'll never, ever live down. So a couple things that I considered here were how fun were the players on the roster? What were the best moments from that season, both for the team and also for me personally? Like, did I get to go to some games? Where was I when I was watching some big wins? Stuff like that, right? Like, that matters to me because when I'm thinking about my all-time favorite teams, most of the time I'm reminiscing about where I was when I watched them play and when they had these big wins. Who was I with? Who was I celebrating those moments with? So it really came down to a few teams. 2005, obvious one as a kid. That team showed me that Notre Dame could actually be really good and really fun to watch because up until that point in my life, I was like, 9 when that season started. Most of the Notre Dame teams that I had watched had sucked, with the exception of that 2002 team, but even they weren't that fun to watch because their offense was abysmal. Then the 2012 team, obviously, Cinderella story. That was a dream season. But if you think back on it, that really wasn't that good of a team. Like, if you were to think about the teams like the past 7 years at Notre Dame, I'm not even sure if the 2012 team would crack the top three. But hey, they went undefeated and they made it to the national championship. 2015 was a team that was so loaded with talent, but they dealt with so many injuries. There's always going to be that what if factor, like what that team could have been, but they were so talented. Will Fuller was so fun to watch. I mean, CJ Prosise, Josh Adams broke out on the scene. And then on defense, guys like Jalen Smith. That was a really fun team. Plus, that was my sophomore year at Notre Dame. Actually, my first year as a student at Notre Dame because I transferred from Holy Cross. So that was like an unbelievable experience for me because that was my first time being able to go to Notre Dame football games as a student. I was like living out my dream for the first time. 2018, undefeated team. That was a really, really talented team. Despite the close calls at the beginning of the year against Ball State and Vandy, they were actually pretty dominant for most of the year. I mean, they had close calls against Pitt and USC. But yeah, really, really good team. They just ran into one of the best college football teams in my lifetime in Clemson in the college football playoff, which brings me to 2020. And I think that's going to go down as my favorite Notre Dame football team of all time. I think a big part of that has to do with the fact that that year was absolutely miserable for everyone. It was the pandemic year. Everything was off. You know, people were not in a great place. They were locked in the house, and it was not a lot of fun. And there was a point in time that season where, actually, that year, where I didn't even think that Notre Dame would play football. I didn't think anyone would play college football that season. And that summer, I did not think it was possible. I was working at ESPN at the time, and I was really excited about that college football season because I was working on College Game Day. The year prior, I'd been able to travel all around the country, going around to different campuses and stuff and live out another dream of mine. And then I was so looking forward to the 2020 season, and then it was all kind of taken from me. So that sucked. But then the Notre Dame team was so good. They go undefeated during the regular season. That win against Clemson was like legitimately one of the happiest moments of my life. And if you think, well, what does that say about your life? I would say, well, it's kind of self-explanatory, right? But that was an unbelievable moment, and I just had so much fun watching that team, and it really just kind of kept my spirits up, and I feel like a lot of people feel the same way about that team and how it kind of kept them going there during the fall, especially at the end of that COVID year. We had already dealt with so much, and it was just such a fun time. It did not end well, and as a matter of fact, the only game that I got to see in person that year was the ACC championship game, which, boy. I'm sure there's a couple of you listening, some of my close friends that were with me on that trip, and it was not a fun one. But you know what? I'm never going to forget the regular season and what that team did and how much talent they had. Kyron Williams, Kyle Hamilton, Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah. I've said this before. I was like the biggest Ian Book fan. He's such a gamer, and I loved watching him play. So I think that's going to be it. Maybe that'll change. Maybe as I think about this a little bit more, maybe it'll change. That 2015 team really does hold a special place in my heart as well. But this is a really hard exercise to do. But that's my final answer. I'm taking that 2020 team over everyone else. All right, now it's time to hear what you guys have to say about your favorite Notre Dame teams. Today's episode is sponsored by FanDuel. The NFL season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is so easy to use, and there are so many different ways to bet, including live same-game parlays. You can find bets in the new Explore tab. You can make a parlay in the Parlay Hub, which is actually the best way to find popular parlays and more. I'm sticking with the pick that I've given out all week. I'm going to be honest, I don't feel super great about it, but I'm taking the Lions +7. I think the 49ers are going to win this one, but I do think the Lions are going to cover. They're feisty. They're a quality team. I love Dan Campbell, and +7 kind of leaves the door open for a backdoor cover there late. It might be a hold on to your butts game, the classic SVP line, but still, I'm going to ride with the Lions like I have been all week. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. All right, so now that I've told you who is my favorite Notre Dame team of all time, let's hear what you guys have to say. And our first response comes from Luke Smith, who said 2020 because there was literally nothing else positive in the world going on. So not surprisingly, Luke and I are on the same page on this one. There just wasn't anything good going on. And that team was like the lone source of happiness that year. And thank God for them, because if that was like a really bad Notre Dame year, that would not have been a lot of fun. That was also the first year, I believe, that Luke and I were doing our old podcast, Sons of Saturday, publicly. So that added a whole new element to that ride of the season. It was a lot of fun, and I had a lot of fun doing that. All right, next one. Nathan Coleman, 45, says that 2020 team was special. So many studs. Ian Book, Kyron Williams, Kyle Hamilton, Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah. Jacoby Wolf says, the 2020 team, the players on that roster, star eyes emoji. I agree on all accounts on this. You think about that team, though, how much NFL talent was on that roster, and I don't even think we truly understood it at the time. Like, everyone knew that Kyle Hamilton was going to be a good NFL player, and any Notre Dame fan watching Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah knew that he was going to be a beast in the NFL, and the fact that he dropped as much as he did in the NFL draft, like, it still is not – it's never going to make sense to me. I know that there was that random medical issue or concern, but he's been doing all right on the Browns. On draft night, I was so pumped to hear that the Browns were able to land him because I never in a million years thought that would happen. And now he's due for a contract extension here pretty soon, and he might reset the market, man. He is just a flat-out stud. But then you got Kurt Hinish, who I was talking about earlier. He's made a serious dent in the NFL. Nick McLeod, the cornerback on that defense that Notre Dame got out of the transfer portal, from NC State. He had a really good year for Notre Dame, and then he's been playing well in the NFL despite going undrafted. So, yeah, I guess it's not surprising that a team with a bunch of NFL dudes ended up going undefeated in the regular season and is one of the best Notre Dame teams of my lifetime. Now, this next one comes from @ND Today, who says 2015, Deshaun Kaiser, Josh Adams, CJ Prosise, Will Fuller, so many studs everywhere. As I said in the previous segment, I almost picked this team, man. Like, they were just so fun to watch, and if they had just stayed healthy, like, I legitimately believe that was the best, or at least the most talented Notre Dame team in my lifetime. I mean, just the offensive line with guys like Ronnie Stanley, Mike McGlinchey as well. They were just so loaded, and then Deshaun Kaiser just came out of nowhere. I think we all had really high expectations for Malik Zaire. He comes out in that Texas game, looks great, and then just the injuries started in that game. Like, Tarian Folson tore his ACL. Durham Smythe suffered like two season-ending injuries on his body. I think he had like a torn labrum, and then he also had a knee thing. Like, it was a sign of things to come, and it was really unfortunate. That team ended up losing the heartbreaker to Clemson in the Hurricane, and then they lost to Christian McCaffrey, essentially, to Stanford there in the last game of the season. Now, that Stanford team was really good. It wasn't just Christian McCaffrey, but, man, he ran all over Notre Dame, and by that point, like, the injuries had finally piled up. I think Notre Dame was starting Devin Butler at corner, and that was a disaster. It was just a really rough end, and then they lost to Ohio State in the Fiesta Bowl. That Ohio State team was awesome. So, like, the record being 10-3 kind of eliminates them from being the best team of my lifetime. But, yeah, man, it's like the ultimate what if because they just had so many NFL dudes. I don't even know if I mentioned Jalen Smith yet, but, yeah, he was incredible, and that was a really good team. So I totally understand why people would pick them in this spot. Okay, Matthew Kemp says the 2012 team. I was actually kind of surprised that I didn't get as many responses about the 2012 team. This was actually the only one, and I guess it's probably because there have been a lot better Notre Dame teams since then, but what a Cinderella story that team was. You got the Teo stuff, which I feel like has sort of like had a comeback because in the immediate aftermath, once you found out about the catfishing thing, it was a little bit weird to think back on that. But now that the documentaries come out and Teo has had I guess a renaissance, so to speak, in the public, and people were like, wow, he actually got a raw deal, even though all the Notre Dame fans who followed that story closely were like, wait a second, I think Teo was just a little bit naive and got taken advantage of, and it was actually a really sad story. Now the rest of the world sees that. It's not as much of a punchline as it used to be. So great for him and great for us as we reminisce on that season. But I think it was Chuck Martin, who was the offensive coordinator at the time. Now he's the head coach, or he's been the head coach of Miami of Ohio for a long time. He was like, that team could have easily gone 3-9, and he's right. There were so many close calls in that season. It felt like whenever it came down to the wire, Notre Dame just found a way to win. Like, the fact that Notre Dame beat Pittsburgh in, triple overtime that season might go down as one of the most improbable wins in the history of Notre Dame. Just that was sort of like a microcosm of the season. There were so many times they shouldn't have won, but they did. And then they had that awesome win against Oklahoma where they were dominant on the road. And Bob Stoops, back in the day, he never lost at home. And Notre Dame kind of dominated them. If they weren't double-digit underdogs in that game, they were close. And that was an all-time moment for me as a Notre Dame football fan. That's still to this day one of the biggest wins of my lifetime. So the 2012 team definitely deserves to be up there. And then we got a few of these talking about those 05 or 06 teams, but more specifically 05. Dan O'Carter says 2005, 2006 teams. They had Brady Quinn, Jeff Smarge, Darius Walker, Thomas Bukowski. Ryan Gradle says 2005. And I hear you guys. Like, when I was a kid, man, I idolized those players like Quinn, Samardzija, even Darius Walker, Tom Zbikowski. Funny story, actually. I was really obsessed with College Game Day at the time and making signs. So I was 9 years old going to the Notre Dame Tennessee game back in 2005. And I had a sign that said like the Four Horsemen. And I had Quinn, Samardzija, Darius, and Zbikowski, I'm pretty sure. But Darius was definitely on there. We walk to our seat, and my family ended up passing Darius Walker's parents, and I knew who they were, but my dad and my mom did not. And the only reason I did is because they would show them on the broadcast. So I literally went up to Darius Walker's dad, and I showed him my poster, and I took a picture of him with it. I wonder if my mom still has that picture somewhere, but that's sort of how I looked at those guys at the time. I was a kid, and they were the first Notre Dame team that was really good, and they were really exciting. So that was a really great team. And yeah, or let me rephrase that. That was a really great team to watch, but in retrospect, they weren't even really that good. Like that 05 team finished 9-3. Notre Dame just finished 9-3 in the regular season last year, and we're all calling it a disappointment. It's just kind of crazy to think about how far the program has come. And I feel like if Notre Dame ever gets to that top level again, where they're, one of the best in the country, that the way that those players are looked at by little kids is going to be similar to the way that I looked at Brady Quinn, Jeff Samardzija, and those guys. So hopefully for this next generation of Notre Dame fans, they have a lot of fun players to root for and a lot more wins to go along with it. All right, this one comes from Doug C. Doug C. says 1992. So this team, obviously not in my lifetime. I was born in 1996, but I did some digging into that 1990. Excuse me. I did some digging into that 1992 team because, I kind of knew about him. Like I knew about Rick Meyer. I knew about the Snow Bowl and all that stuff. But damn, the amount of NFL talent on that team was staggering. They had a bunch of future first and second round picks. They finished 10-1-1 that year. They tied Michigan, and they had a bad loss to Stanford at home. That's one thing. Maybe I'll do another show about this. I've kind of been thinking about this for a while now. Like, as much as we all love Lou Holtz, and he was a phenomenal coach at Notre Dame, I'm not trying to diminish his career, but like, if you look back and you go through the game logs year by year, Notre Dame would lose to some teams where you're like, what? With as talented as they were, maybe that's just a Notre Dame thing. Like they're just forever plagued by losing games. You're like, how did that even happen? How did they have a complete no-show in that game? So that's one thing about the Lou Holtz era that I don't think gets talked about all that much because they had some all-time great teams and then lose to teams you're like, how did that even happen? That happened in 1992 when they lost to Stanford. Even though Stanford was ranked, they beat Notre Dame by I think it was 17 points that year. So still a great team, a lot of great players to root for. I can see why that's at the top. Honestly, if the college football playoff existed back then, they probably could have won the national championship. This last one, Chris Kozicki. I hope I said that right, Chris. 1988. I think this one's self-explanatory. It's the last team to win a national championship. I mean, that one is just so obvious, and I've read so much about that team, and I've watched the highlights, and what an unbelievable team that was. I just hope that at one point in my lifetime, I get to experience something quite like that 1988 season, because not only was the team really good, they win the national championship, all that stuff, but their schedule was so brutal. They beat up on so many really good teams. So not only was it fun that they won the national championship, they had so many great moments along the way that, like, frankly, that doesn't happen that often anymore. You look at Michigan, they had a cakewalk schedule up until November. And yeah, they had a couple great wins to close out the year, but Notre Dame was doing it from the opening weekend back in 88. And that's really how they were throughout the Lou Holtz era. So yeah, I hear you, Chris. I wish I was alive, at least for that season. But hopefully we'll get another run like 1988 here in the near future. All right, that's going to do it for me today. That is another week of Locked On Irish in the books. Thanks again for making this your first listen of the day. I'll be back on Tuesday of next week. Until then, be sure to subscribe to the show on YouTube or wherever you're listening to the podcast. And you can give us a follow on X at Locked On Irish, on Instagram at Locked On Irish Pod. And you can follow my personal X account at Tyler, WOJCIAK. Have a great weekend. I'll see you next week.